Welcome to our new iteration of the Pathways to Progress speaker series. Today, we are joined by Caleb Watney, who is the co-founder and co-CEO of the Institute for Progress. Caleb manages the meta science and immigration policy teams at the IFP. His research focuses on policy levers the U.S. could use to rebuild state capacity and increase long-term rates of innovation. His commentary has been published in the Washington Post, The Atlantic, Politico, Lawfare, and the National Review. Previously, Caleb worked as the Director of Innovation Policy at the Progressive Policy Institute, a Technology Policy Fellow at the Art Street Institute, and a Graduate Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center. We will begin with around 20 minutes of questions from me, and then we will just open up to Q&A with the audience. Caleb, welcome.
Hey guys, happy to join you.
All right, so I'll just begin with questions on the Institute for Progress. So I wanted to ask you, how did the Institute for Progress begin, and what is the role of a think tank in building an entrepreneurial state?
Good questions. So on the first question, my co-founder, Alec, and I, we'd kind of both been in DC for a number of years. I've been here for almost 9 years now and have kind of worked in tech and science policy roles actually across the political spectrum. But we decided we want to start a new organization for a couple of reasons. One is we thought on like topic area selection, the issues we thought were the most important and the most tractable and then the most neglected were not actually getting the most attention. A lot of the traditional tech policy think tanks in DC will focus on issues that I sort of think of as being trench warfare issues. They're things like antitrust, privacy, Section 230 content moderation, net neutrality. Those sorts of issues take up the bulk of other orgs and kind of what we had previously been working on. But it just felt like, these are both deeply entrenched kind of on both sides of the aisle. And I could write another 40-page white paper and toss it into the void, but the odds that it was actually going to do anything meaningful or change the stakes of the debate felt pretty small to us. Whereas we thought there was sort of an orthogonal set of issues that mattered just as much, if not more, that were getting a tiny, tiny fraction of the attention. And oftentimes, the reason for that was because we thought the beneficiaries weren't actually in a position to be able to advocate for themselves. So if you're working on regulatory issues that affect large tech companies, they can kind of lobby for themselves. They can spend resources on other think tanks and whatnot. But in the case of, say, high-skilled immigration, the future founders that will come to the United States, we hope, and sort of build companies here or sort of contribute to scientific progress before they're ever in the United States, they obviously can't kind of contribute to themselves. Same thing kind of on, say, science funding. There's a lot of forces in DC that are kind of just pushing generically for higher funding levels across the board. And, to be clear, I think that would be good. We should probably be spending more on science. But there's a much smaller conversation about, given a certain level that we're going to spend, how can we actually make sure that that is being spent the most efficaciously? How can we change the incentives that scientists are facing to help them work on kind of more breakthrough research? So those are some of the issues that we wanted to spend more time on, and we thought launching kind of a new organization was the best way to do it. There's other things we can get into later around sort of structures and incentives within think tanks, but I think the biggest reason was just cause prioritization. To your second question, what is the role of think tanks in building an entrepreneurial state? As many of you probably know, the U.S. government is not like an especially vaunted for their managerial capacity or for their ability to think, over long-term strategy. Oftentimes, it feels like if you're talking to staffers, they are dramatically underpaid, really overworked. They have huge kind of issue areas that they, as 24-year-olds, are supposed to be managing, and oftentimes they're writing legislative text. And so just the number of resourcing we're able to put towards sort of policy analysis within the government is really off in the United States government, I think, relative to how important these decisions are. And so think tanks kind of fill this kind of weird role. Actually, think tanks in the US are a much bigger deal than think tanks in other parts of the world are. And partially it's because I think that sort of like how, if you're a young, ambitious person who wants to kind of like help push policy forward, is the most natural place to do that within the government, or are there enough blockers that doesn't really make sense? And so then I think kind of when that's the case, this like larger nonprofit ecosystem kind of blooms up. And one thesis that I like for what is it that think tanks do is called legislative subsidy, But the idea is basically you're subsidizing all the work that's supposed to go into the legislative or oftentimes executive process, whether that is technical analysis, sort of idea generation,
Mm.
oftentimes coalition building, getting other people on board, political cover, making the case for something. So think tanks kind of are, I think in the best case, almost a lubricant for good policy making to happen in light of this sort of ecosystem that's really under-resourced.
Mm. I see. Yeah. So I guess my first follow-up question there is, I guess you mentioned just now and other places that IFP tries to push progress in like a bipartisan and like non-controversial areas. You're a big fan of the Secret Congress thesis, by I forgot what his name was.
Yeah, Matt Iglesias and
Yeah,
Cindy
Mike
Basil.
Galexius,
Yeah.
yes. So have there been any policy areas that IFP works on that actually you were met with policy resistance, or you might anticipate policy resistance in the future?
Yeah, so for the most part, we try to focus on issues that we think are really under the radar and not getting a lot of kind of polarization. For listeners that aren't familiar, the general idea behind the secret Congress theory is that Congress is actually sometimes surprisingly productive. A lot of the issues you'll hear about on the news are the least tractable and the most polarized, and there's kind of this giant tug of war match happening between liberals and conservatives on different sides. And if that's all you're really paying attention to, it's easy to sort of get the impression that nothing is really happening. But in actuality, there are a lot of smaller, less polarized bills that are moving forward. Obviously, the regulatory agencies are moving, thousands to tens of thousands of decisions per year, and all of those really matter. And the sort of the thrust of this article is pointing out that actually there's a weird relationship between legibility and visibility and actually effectiveness. That once your issue has kind of been become platformed and more people are paying attention to it, it naturally becomes sort of a target in this giant partisan tug of war fight. And so once your issue is on the front page of the New York Times or you're getting talked about by Rachel Maddow and Tucker Carlson, you've kind of lost. It's beyond your control as an individual policy entrepreneur. Now you're just in these, giants like Godzilla and King Kong. All you can do is watch. And so we really try to focus on issues that are not kind of in that giant tug of war match. I like the analogy that you should try to find areas where you can pull the rope sideways so they aren't in some sense polarized along the neat tug of war axis, and instead like there's really not any resistance on the other side and you can kind of nudge it along. Now, in actuality, that doesn't mean that it's extremely easy to get things passed. Getting anything through Congress or done in policy can take a while, but oftentimes the resistance is more structural factors like inertia rather than a specific interest group or coalition that is sort of opposing you, although sometimes that can be the case as well. In terms of the issues we work on, and just to kind of give your listeners an overview, so we work on 5 major issues. We work on meta science, sometimes called the science of science. Basically, how can we be more scientific about the way that we fund science? And I think there's a lot of concern that the way we're currently structuring science funding is one that encourages scientists to work on their most incremental idea. They're not really aiming for their high risk, high reward breakthrough ideas. One example, Caitlin Carrico, the Hungarian-born scientist who is pivotal behind mRNA vaccines, she was trying to get funding from the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, throughout the early 90s and kind of getting consistently turned down because her ideas were just too far out there. And yet, I think if she had been funded at an earlier date, I think we could have sort of moved along the entire mRNA vaccine pipeline like almost a decade. And so we as a society, in some sense, lost out on massive gains because our science funding system was not really encouraging scientists or supporting them to work on their highest risk, most breakthrough ideas. So that's just one subset of that. But this, how do we sort of get more serious about the incentives we're building into our science funding is one issue. We also work on high-skilled immigration. How do we make it easier for scientists, engineers, mathematicians, they're like to come and live and work in the United States and kind of contribute to the frontier here. Of all the issues we work on, this is probably the most polarized, and mostly it's because it has the word immigration in it. The reason we work on it is because we think it's the one narrow corner of the immigration landscape where you can actually find some bipartisan compromise. There's also a lot you can do through the executive branch to kind of move forward curated visa platforms like the O1 visa for immigrants of extraordinary ability, which is really cool. Third, just to keep it going, we work on sort of biotechnology, which we think of as kind of 2 sides. One, how do we make sure we're taking advantage of all this new excitement around sort of biotech, mRNA vaccines being one example, but also CRISPR and, sort of like new weight loss drugs. I mean, there's a bunch of really cool stuff kind of coming out of pharma. We want to make sure we're picking low-hanging fruit. On the other hand, how do we balance those really awesome upside benefits against some of the downside risks of making it, trivially easy to design new bioweapons or something? And how can we kind of get one without the other? Fourth, we do work on infrastructure, which we really think of as how do we make it easier to build in the physical world. One of our senior fellows writes this really great newsletter called Construction Physics, where he's sort of been documenting the fact that over the last 50 years, productivity in the construction sector has been falling in real terms, which is kind of wild and bizarre. As sort of a person with an econ background, we expect productivity to go up in time, and it's a rare thing actually when it stagnates. But when it goes down over time, that's like when you know there should be really big warning bells, and it's really hard for us to build housing or transit or any number of other things we'd want to build as the U.S. And then we're starting to kind of expand some of our work on AI and other emerging technologies as well. And that's sort of our newest area, but I think there's a really productive role for the US government to play in being proactive about shaping the direction of this new technology. So it's kind of in the public interest.
Great. Yeah, so have there been like any policy areas where you faced any like political resistance at all? Or have these been pretty have policymakers been pretty receptive to IFP's mission for progress so
Yeah, I mean,
far?
so for the most part, people have been, pretty welcoming towards it. I think the idea of like, hey, let's have better science, let's be more
Mm,
effective about how we're spending things, let's make it easier to build in the real world are generally positive. There are, of course, I think like immigration does require letting in additional folks, and there are some people that are just very restrictionist and kind of don't want to increase immigration at all, and so that can be a barrier. And then on the infrastructure side, of course, we've really been targeting NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, which was a law passed in the 1970s with good intentions, but has sort of unintentionally made it dramatically more difficult to actually build things like housing or even things to help our climate, whether it be giant solar farms or offshore wind or any number of other things.
mm.
But there's sort of like a large lobby that is sort of dependent on NEPA, and that's like sort of how they structure a lot of their activities. So those have probably been the two areas where we faced the most political resistance.
Gotcha. In terms of uh well, when you write about building an entrepreneurial state, a lot of it is talking about like about incentive alignment with aligning bureaucrats' incentives to do experiments, for example, that have the most effective um, uh, to search for the most effective policies through experiments, for example. But I guess like when we think about long-term progress, it seems to me like one of the biggest uh, ways in which incentives could be unaligned is that policymakers, politicians, they're in office for a very short term, while we are looking for policy that might see effects in a very long duration of time. It might have lag effects and whatnot. So how do you see aligning incentives in that kind of like temporal, in like temporal?
Yeah, no, that's a good question.
Mhm.
And it's a difficult one. So there's a lot of ways you could attack this. So at the highest level, in some sense, what we want to do as a society, what we see a role for is funding public goods, things that sort of normal competitive markets are not going to fund through just sort of their own traditional set of incentives. And oftentimes people will point to the federal government as sort of the natural actor that can try to step in and provide these public goods. And so if companies aren't investing enough in long-term R&D because they're not going to see the payoffs until 30 years, that's why we created the National Science Foundation to kind of invest in basic research that we didn't think the commercial sector would fund. But there's lots of other kinds of public goods. And precisely to your point, sometimes the federal government actually, even though it is one of the actors that can sort of try to work to fund these public goods, due to weird incentives internally or sort of democratic feedback loops really pushing for short-term action, sometimes they don't fill that. And so the larger category, I think, is often best filled by the government, but that doesn't mean that it actually will. And sometimes you see cases where the private sector or nonprofits can kind of fill the gaps in interesting ways. One example that comes to mind is, for fighting climate change, one thing that would be really useful is the ability to remove carbon dioxide at like a really mass, almost industrial scale. Because there are some some emissions that we can reduce, but there's a lot that we've already emitted, and having the ability to suck those back out of the atmosphere would be really, really useful. Uh, the federal government has spent some money on like R&D for these kinds of technologies, but it has not really been a major focus. But a couple of years ago, there was sort of a coalition of companies, one of them being Stripe, the financial payment processing company, which launched an advanced market commitment, which is basically a way of saying, if you can sort of credibly show us that you can suck carbon out of the atmosphere at certain cost levels, we're going to promise to buy, hundreds to thousands to millions of tons of this. And so then you can know with certainty as you're investing or trying to move this technology along that you have this market. That's the kind of thing that like probably the federal government should have been doing. And it's a real shame that actually we weren't. But like I'm glad that we did have almost like a second resort, public goods provider in this sort of like interesting, industrial coalition. And so I'm glad that that existed, but it is a little bit of a shame that kind of like the federal government didn't do it.
Mm.
Now, I think there are ways to try to improve the sort of incentive alignment between the federal government and these sort of long-term goals. I mean, one interesting thing is that we have a set of institutions that are supposed to be doing this. One of them is the Congressional Budget Office, CBO. And so before any piece of legislation comes to the floor, gets a major passage, the analysts at CBO will sort of go through whatever the fiscal costs and benefits are going to be, and they're going to try to analyze like what's the impact on the federal deficit. And so this isn't the full cost benefit to like all of society, but at least to the federal deficit.
Mm.
But one thing that's happened is actually Congress has sort of mandated we only want you to look within a 10-year window. And so anything that happens beyond the 10-year window, they are sort of like categorically not allowed to include or look at, which is a real distortion because for a lot of these things, you care about what are the long-term benefits.
Right.
And so changing, say, how does the CBO's like 10-year budget window, can we help
Mm.
them push it out further or like enable them to look at longer-term benefits would be one way of trying to sort of like think through the alignment. That's a very small case study, but I think there's examples of that kind of all across the government.
Interesting. Yeah, so in your article, progress is a policy choice that kind of set up IFP and everything. You briefly mentioned why the US is the most important R&D hub in the world. And so yeah, given what you just said about, state capacity, building the US leadership right now, how, like, if you had to assign a number, what percent of US leadership is explained by like past state capacity of the United States? And what percent of the current stagnation that you see is explained by changes to such state capacity?
Interesting question. It's hard to put precise numbers on this. I mean, this is going to be very inherently
Yeah,
like hand wavy, and
right.
I need to do the back of the envelope calculation.
Yeah,
Even then, you're still just waving your hands. Let me almost start in a different direction than maybe end up back there. When
for
I think
sure.
about what explains kind of the US's leadership and innovation, a lot of it are some of these big structural forces that have been the result of policy action, but have almost like taken on a life of themselves.
Mm.
So, for example, we are just a very large country in a lot of dimensions. We are a physically large country, which means you sort of have ways for different regional kind of cultures to pop up, and you can sort of have tech clusters that specialize in one technology or another that are harder to do sometimes in a small country. We're also a big country just in terms of population, which
Mm.
is useful both because like market share allows you to shape kind of consumer preferences around goods. And sort of when you have startups here, like you'll have startups in Sweden or Ireland that will move to the United States because our market is so much larger.
Mm.
So that is itself a benefit. But then just having a large population is useful too. You're also just getting more kind of draws on finding like the next superstar scientist who has, a new idea that, is on par with Einstein or something. And if you have a larger population, that's going to be much easier. You also have the ability to do, not to go way back, but Adam Smith, father of economics, said the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. And he just meant that as you have an increasing population, you can get increasing specialization, and that enables kind of productivity across this whole area. And so the US being a large country that has a large population enables us to sort of have a lot more specialization. The fact that you can have scientists who spend their entire time tinkering around with little particle colliders is, of course, enabled by the fact that we have such a large, huge, rich economy. So that is a kind of structural factor that I think explains a lot of US innovation. But was itself, downstream of policy decisions, centuries ago or decades ago. I mean, the decision to buy the Louisiana Purchase was in some sense a really major kind of like investment that set the United States up to, double its size and kind of start expanding over to the coast. And so
Right.
who's to say what a counterfactual US is without that?
Mm.
Another big structural force is, I think, the fact that so many of the world's top immigrants want to come and move here.
Mm.
So our population is like around, I think, like 350 million. We're something like only 4% of the global population, which is actually pretty small when you think about it. I think a lot of people would intuitively, like, if you would ask them, they would say, like 10%, 15%, but we're only 4%. We're pretty small. And so again, if you kind of buy the axiom that talent is at least roughly equally distributed across the globe, but opportunity is not, then that means that most of the world's like potential geniuses, potential superstar scientists are going to be born somewhere else in the world. And no one country actually has like that large a share of the overall population. And so countries that are opening and accepting to immigrants, and especially immigrants that can come from anywhere in the world, are going to have a huge advantage for immigration, for innovation, because you just have such a larger talent pool to draw from.
Mm.
And this is both important in terms of number of immigrants, but also like type of immigrant. If you look at different countries around the world and like how large of a share of their population is made up of immigrants, you have some countries like Brazil that have pretty high immigrant shares of their population, but they're very regionally kind of not diverse. Like it comes a lot from like, Central and South America. Um, the fact that almost any country will have sort of a population of people here in the United States that you can feel like you fit in means that sort of like we are drawing from just like all over the world rather than just one, region or subcontinent. And so I think like our ability to integrate immigrants, and the fact that so many immigrants want to move here is itself like another just massive, huge structural factor.
Mm.
Um, and then there's a certain amount of just inertia, like because we have become like the world's leading destination for scientists and engineers, that has kind of a self-perpetuating effect. If you are wanting to go to grad school, you want to go to the place where all the other smartest, most sharp people are. And so, coming to MIT or to Harvard or to Berkeley or whatever, ends up becoming a really huge draw for kind of a lot of the world's top talent. Now, that doesn't mean that it's permanent. We can't lose it, but it is like just a pretty huge inertial kind of structural factor that's in our favor.
Mm. Okay, I'll have one more question and then I'll open it up to Q&A. And I also have some backup questions in case like we run out. So this is a very general question, but where does, political participation, a lot of IFP's work targets like bureaucracy and like its workings. But I was wondering, like, how does the citizenry, how does political participation, how does the political discourse fit into building an entrepreneurial state? And I think some thinkers in progress studies, they believe that, we kind of lost like this ethos for progress. And a lot of us, we have like a culture of anti-progress right now. But do you agree with that?
Yeah, so FP is really focused on like a particular theory of change and a particular theory of action. That's not to say it's the only theory. And in fact,
Mm.
I want to let 1,000 flowers bloom, and people should pursue very different kind of strategies that are different
Mm.
from ours. And hopefully we'll all get more progress that way. Ours is pretty focused on sort of what's called like grass tops advocacy. We're trying to focus on the folks who are already in Congress or already in the executive branch, or people that are sort of directly influencing what are the set of actions or ideas that they're
Mm.
focused on. How can we change what they're thinking about, what they think is reasonable, and almost taken as a given, like what is the populace writ large's like opinion on things? I think it is a very worthwhile and good thing to do to like try to increase the favorability of things like nuclear energy. Like let's try to do a grassroots campaign to make people more excited about that. That would be great. I think that'd be super positive. That's not kind of what our organization is specialized in doing, but it's like a totally legitimate and like important form of political participation. And so I want to make like that clear, that just because
Mm.
we're not doing something doesn't mean it's not worthwhile or would be useful for someone to do. Um, I think there is a really important role to try to like persuade the populace to accept more risks, to accept kind of more change. This is something the economist Tyler Cowen wrote a book called The Great Stagnation, and then later on The Complacent Class. And then similarly, the columnist Ross Douthat wrote an interesting book called The Decadent Society. And I thought actually like The Decadent Society and The Complacent Class they both came out around the same time, and they were kind of focused on this element to which we were kind of a victim of our own success, that as a society gets richer and more comfortable, you naturally become like less willing to take on changes or challenges. It's just easier for you. You have less to give up in some sense if you're starting from a lower baseline. But once you already have the comfy house in the suburbs, sort of moving to a new country or moving to a new state to, risk it all becomes less viable. Similarly, kind of tolerating larger change around you becomes more annoying. And so I think there are certain parts of this that are almost like self-explanatory, but that almost make the cultural aspect of this almost more important to help kind of get over that. And one, I think, nice example of this that I've seen is the YIMBY movement. So there's NIMBY, not in my backyard, and YIMBY, yes, in my backyard, that is really focused on trying to change people's opinions on sort of housing in their area. And it's kind of remarkable that they've had as much success as they have, because it is like inherently annoying to have construction around your house. Like, I love new construction. I want to see a lot more of it. But sometimes when I see construction near me, there's a part of me that's like, this is annoying. There's, there's traffic, there's all sorts of things. And so the fact that there's a cultural movement that has kind of bubbled up and sort of helped valorize kind of building new things is really, really exciting. I'd love to kind of see more versions of that. So yeah, 2 thumbs up.
Okay, we open up to Q&A. If you have any questions, you can raise your hand on Zoom. And I think Laura will spotlight you.
Okay, well, oh, Brian, you go first.
Oh, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, well, yeah, Caleb, thanks for speaking with us today. Here's my question. I don't know how to articulate this very well, so forgive me if I ramble a little bit. But regarding meta science and how we do science, how we make that work, there's that paper from Nicholas Bloom and other co-authors about an apparent, fairly dramatic drop in scientific productivity. And I posed this question to Jason Crawford a couple weeks ago, and he was here, and I'll pose it to you. First off, do you think that they're right in their in just basic elements of the analysis? And if so, what do you think is the best explanation for why this is happening?
Yeah, important question. So maybe just to briefly summarize the paper for folks who haven't come across it. The idea is basically they wrote a paper called Our Idea is Getting Harder to Find, and it looked across a number of different sort of industries or scientific areas and kind of showed that to get the next kind of innovation or the next big productivity improvement just seems to require many, many more either like labor hours or kind of investment, whether it's through R&D. And so I think they looked at like chip construction. I think they maybe looked at pharmaceuticals, and they looked at agriculture. I might be mixing some of those up, but yeah, they looked at very specific industries and kind of showed, hey, look, to get to increase the productivity per hectare for agriculture, you can just see it's taking more and more resources and more people to do that, and kind of what's going on. And they kind of hypothesized that similar to Tyler Cowen's argument in kind of The Great Stagnation, that we ate the low-hanging fruit. We kind of picked the most natural scientific findings to find. You can only do things like invent the wheel once and invent electricity once, and then as you go on to the next thing, it becomes harder and harder. And so this is kind of just a natural phenomenon. And so I think the paper, it's obviously very important, and it has struck a lot of dialogue. And I think there's part of it that is absolutely true. It seems unambiguous to me that it is getting harder to make innovations or to kind of come up with the next productivity breakthrough, or it's at the very least requiring more resources. That doesn't tell you what is happening though. And of course, we don't have like a nice randomized control trial where you can sort of like see, okay, conditional on institutional quality. If we had the same type of science funding regimes in like the 1960s as we do today, what would we be seeing? Because there's obviously been a lot of change. And so I think it does accurately show that there's been a slowdown, but it doesn't tell us why. If I had to guess, I do think there's part of it is low-hanging fruit. That seems unambiguous to me. I think in the course of one summer, Einstein had 3 cutting edge physics papers that became the basis of the unified or of general relativity and all these really important physics kind of breakthroughs. And a couple of years ago, we needed like a giant team of thousands of people to just prove the existence of the Higgs boson. And that was kind of the next marginal step forward in physics. And it also required a huge amount of infrastructure through the Giant Particle Collider. So I think that is absolutely one thing that's happening, but I don't think that's the entire story. I think our scientific institutions, we just have not really had a lot of variation in it. And so I want to see like a lot more experimentation and effort to see what are new ways of funding science and how does that kind of change it. And so I think it's gotten harder, but I don't think we should feel fatalistic. I think there's a lot more we could do. There's a ton more low-hanging fruit. And actually, I think this idea around mRNA vaccines is an interesting example. So we had one of our fellows just recently kind of publish a retrospective on mRNA vaccines and how much sooner could we have had it. And basically, his insight is that it doesn't seem like there were structural kind of scientific barriers we had to unlock. We basically had a kind of a working version of mRNA in the early 2000s. And it was just a lack of funding to actually kind of get through some of these later implementation barriers and, making lipid nanoparticle, diffusion mechanisms. But we could have plausibly had them 10 to 15 years earlier if we had a different kind of science funding system, or if we had a better way of identifying high risk, high reward research and funding it. And so I think there's a lot more to do. One thing you could also say is that the way that we fund science has remained remarkably stable over the last 60 years. The NSF and the NIH are basically doing the same things. They're using, sort of consensus peer review to rank applications and then fund scientists working primarily at universities who are doing that work. But the way what science looks like has actually changed quite a lot since then. So the economist Ben Jones has done a lot of work documenting the rise of what's sometimes called team science. The idea being that it used to be sort of small groups of either one or two scientists working together would be enough to kind of come up with the next breakthrough. And now you're seeing, these huge teams of 10, 20, 15, or in some cases, 1,000 people kind of working together. And that would imply, I think, naturally a pretty different way of funding science. And so the fact that we've seen a huge change in how science is being conducted, but the funding system has stayed remarkably the same, points to me that there's actually a lot of low-hanging fruit that we could be identifying if we had more creative ways to kind of fund science.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. I do just want to ask a very, very quick follow-up to that.
Yep.
And that is, two aspects of this paper that stand out in the specific areas that they look at. One is declining research productivity, but also two is kind of a counterbalancing force, increase in the total number of researchers and scientists who are working on these problems. Is there potentially, do you see an element of diminishing returns in here that in terms of the number of scientists that are working?
Yeah, I think this is another interesting part of this. So another finding that Michael's alluding to is the fact that even though it's getting harder to generate the next kind of unit of scientific breakthrough, we seem to be getting at roughly the same pace. And it's because we're actually just applying almost exponentially more resources, either in funding or person hours, to these scientific endeavors. And so the overall rate of progress has kind of remained remarkably stable, despite a huge increase in the number of resources. And I think that brings together a bunch of actually interesting management questions. Like, how do you think about what does it look like to sort of manage a really well-run scientific lab? It's something that's probably way more important now that you have these huge teams of scientists working together than when it was sort of one-off lone wolf scientists working by themselves, sort of scribbling equations on a chalkboard. And so the kind of the how do you construct people to work together? Almost the sociology of science is becoming, I think, really important for kind of understanding breakthroughs. And one reason we might be seeing slowdowns is because, you can throw more people at it, but if you don't actually have productive ways for them to work together, then you're getting diminishing returns on sort of each additional unit of sort of scientific labor, basically.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Hey, Caleb. Thanks for coming today. I used to work in sort of industrial policy and innovation before my current job. So definitely love all the work that you guys are doing at the Institute for Progress, and it's exciting to have a think tank that's basically just dedicated to these kinds of issues and are maybe, like you said, maybe just trying to pull the rope sideways rather than adding to one side or the other. And on that note, I guess I was just wondering whether in your work you thought you saw an increased interest, especially following the pandemic, from legislators in rebuilding state capacity in the ways that you're talking about, and whether you think maybe, I guess the context I'm thinking of is the mRNA vaccines that you're talking about. A big reason that they eventually did get made is because we had this small government agency that probably nobody had heard of until the pandemic, BARDA, right, that did a lot of the early funding on the mRNA vaccine that the NIH passed up and stuff like that. So I guess I'm just curious if you're seeing maybe more of an interest in rebuilding state capacity in the way that you're talking about, and maybe also if this is more of a secret Congress versus public Congress kind of issue as well.
Yeah. So on the second question, I'll maybe start with that and go back to the first. I think it's definitely a secret Congress issue. I think it's hard to get the American public kind of up in arms about. I mean, actually, maybe I'll revise that. I do think you could, like, most Americans would agree, like, government doesn't seem to work in the way that they think is intuitive or it should work. Everyone sort of, lambasts their experience with the DMV as kind of being the epitome of bad public service. On the flip side, I think a lot of people during COVID really liked the experience of ordering the free COVID tests that the federal government did. And that was like a really simple, easy to use interface. And, it was good kind of service delivery. You may be using a different example, version 1.0 of the Obamacare market was really bad, but then version 2.0, when they finally got their act together, was like quite good. And it'll be interesting to see right now, as it's tax season. I was filing my taxes earlier today, so it's top of mind. But there's like Intuit using their own software, and then now you have the IRS finally able to kind of like do a demo of their own version of that. And so, how does the government deliver services to people can certainly be something that is important. But I think the mechanics of how you actually do this well are probably going to have to be a secret Congress, partially because they're just inherent trade-offs between the American public doesn't like spending money and they don't like paying high salaries oftentimes, but that's sometimes what's required to actually get good service. And so trying to find ways to make that politically sustainable is going to be hard, but I think important. So yeah, I think there's a mix of both. Like it would be good to sort of generate more public goodwill for government services that work and are effective, but the implementation details are probably going to be more behind the scenes. In terms of policymakers' appetite post-COVID, I think it's a mixed bag. I think there's obviously some policymakers that are really excited about this topic, and I think see it as more relevant than ever. And BARDA did a great job funding a lot of early stuff, and we've been trying to push to get them more resourcing and funding. It's a little bit unclear how that's going right now. Especially in a high inflation environment, Congress is not especially excited to kind of spend new money. But I do think there's beginning to become a playbook for what does more effective agency action look like that's starting to diffuse. And so I'll look at one specific example here. Government contracting is really hard. And traditionally, when a government wants to buy a good or a service or work with some outside group, they have to go through the federal acquisition regulation process, FAR. It's a total nightmare. It's a bureaucracy. Only 10 companies have specialized in actually navigating this bureaucratic system in a way that they win a lot of the big contracts. But it's a huge detriment for kind of governments to be able to work with private sector or nonprofit actors in kind of a more interesting, innovative way. There is a different way to kind of get around this. So there's something called Other Transactions Agreement, OTA. This is something that's sort of pioneered a lot by the Defense Department and NASA and DARPA have kind of maybe been the three biggest users of OTA. NASA actually used this kind of structure to finance SpaceX in the early days of kind of commercial space, and so that was exciting. But what's been cool to me to see is this knowledge that, hey, you can use OTA to sort of give agencies much more flexible contracting powers and enable them to do more interesting ways of financing innovation. That has actually been percolating. More agencies are starting to get approval to use OTA. And so just in the CHIPS and Science Act, both NIST and the National Science Foundation got OTA authorization. And so again, nobody celebrated this. This was not a front headline issue, but I talked to the bureaucrats on the ground and they're like, oh yeah, we're starting to use this. It's great. It's so much more flexible than a traditional FAR stuff. And so that's one small story that I think some of the early lessons are beginning to get applied. I think on the other side, it's just hard to prioritize these sorts of things because you don't win votes with voters. You're always going to prioritize what are the nice sound bites, what are the things, and we're in an election year, and so a lot's not happening. So I think there's some good stuff and there's some bad. And in some sense, I'm concerned that the lessons from COVID are being forgotten too early. But at this point, I'll take any positive change. So there are some useful lessons being learned.
Thank you. Yeah, and I know also the OTAs are a big part of Operation Warp Speed, which I wish people would be a little more proud and talk up more. But yeah, it's good to hear that some of the changes and some of the lessons we learned from that are percolating. And yeah, of course, there's always the push and pull of what the legislator has to do to get himself reelected versus what if he were a dictator, he could be interested in terms of getting policy changes. But
maybe one macro thing that I'm slightly optimistic about is I think for a long time, the kind of main dividing axis in government, or at least within political parties, was sort of smaller versus bigger government. And I don't know that this is a particularly helpful framework. And I feel like both sides are actually now realizing that we have goals for things that we want to accomplish in society. And whether that is, onshoring domestic manufacturing in certain key industrial areas, or whether it's sort of, launching in a new, green industrial revolution or whatever. To do those things, you have to be able to actually accomplish your goals through policy. And so as this sort of big to small government axis is becoming less the central node of US politics, and instead it's kind of other things, I'm optimistic that maybe both sides will start to care about, well, regardless of what our goals are, we actually have to have the ability to do things through government if we want to be able to do anything at all.
Yeah, no, that's actually really encouraging to hear, because that's just been a big roadblock for a long time to any of these discussions. Yeah. Thanks.
Hi, Caleb. Thanks for the talk. Making sure that is my sound okay?
Yep.
Okay, good. It happened a couple weeks ago. It didn't come through. A couple weeks ago, in one of our smaller group discussions, we had a conversation about kind of like what makes America like be able to pull levers of progress better than anyone else. More specifically, like what makes Silicon Valley such a generator for all of these ideas and other pockets in America. And kind of like, is there a secret sauce to do this? If you took like a country in Europe or in Asia and kind of did everything the US is doing right now, or more specifically like Silicon Valley, would you see the same levels of progress? I'm curious, I guess, more philosophically, like, do you think that's possible if you did everything the US did and maybe a smaller European country? Do you think that would be possible, or is there something special about America specifically? I know you mentioned, for instance, funding here in the discussion today.
Yeah. I think there's like some parts policy getting it right. So basically, you can set up the preconditions in a way that increase your probability of success, but it is no way deterministic. And there's lots of chances that you could sort of set up all the preconditions perfectly and then still fail. I think Silicon Valley in particular is kind of like magic. It's wild the way it's sort of both been created in the first place and then been able to be persistent. I mean, they are, despite decades of bad policy, say around things like housing that would have, I think, killed many lesser tech clusters, they are still revving up stronger than ever. I sometimes make the analogy between Twitter and San Francisco. They are both a sort of really important sort of, watering holes where a lot of the sort of biggest actors in the world are sort of exchanging ideas, and both of them have absolutely terrible governance structures, but no one is going to leave because like the agglomeration effects are so strong. Yeah, I don't know how you could recreate San Francisco. I think a lot of people have tried. You've seen like sort of Silicon Slopes and the Silicon Desert and the Silicon whatever, and people are doing, random knockoffs. I think a big problem with sort of like regional innovation development has, I think, historically been very focused, actually too much on financing and not enough on human capital. So I think oftentimes there's an effort to say, we want Cleveland to be the next biomedical hub in the world. And, our politicians have decided that sounds nice. So like, let's just shower it in money, and not a lot happens. And there's sort of, just a long story tradition of sort of failure in these attempts. I think financing is obviously helpful, all else equal. But if I were trying to like start a new tech cluster somewhere, I think one, you would have to think about what are areas where there's not already an existing tech hub. Like you can't just say like, oh, AI, that's big in San Francisco, let's try to replicate that somewhere else. I think that's going to be unlikely. But you could choose something where there's not kind of a pre-existing tech tech cluster, and really try to sort of specialize in that area. And I would take like a tech or a talent focused kind of development strategy. So my personal idea is I would take a university and then sort of try to, rather than being well-rounded, be really pointy and sharp on one dimension and say, you know what, we're going to have the best university department in the world on this one extremely narrow and kind of esoteric area. We're going to hire the brightest young person, and then we're going to tell them you get to pick your entire faculty team, which is something you wouldn't be able to do at like a Harvard or an MIT or something. And then, try to give, incentives for similar industrial developments around that. And I don't know that people have really tried the kind of the talent focused approach with financing as a second best thing rather than the financing in the first place. But separate from all the policy environments, I think there is something cultural that's just hard to measure. Having gone to San Francisco a lot of times, there is just something almost like ambition raising. You go there and people are constantly telling you like, what is a more ambitious version of this project than you're currently thinking about? And that's something rare, and I don't think you can just like affect through policy levers. more generally, I think sort of ambition and a self-starter attitude is something that the US really has compared to especially lots of parts of Europe. There's something called like tall poppy syndrome, basically the idea that sort of being a bit too proud or excited about your own accomplishments is something that's really frowned upon in large parts of Europe, and it can be obnoxious here in the United States, to be clear. But sort of the celebration of success and of kind of like reaching great heights. It has a lot of upsides and also has a lot of downsides. But if you really care about innovation, you want to sort of encourage people to work on the most ambitious and exciting version of their idea, I think some kind of culture like that is really important.
Hi, Caleb. Thank you for sharing the thoughts. Thank you for the talk. Very interesting. So I have a question that is kind of like, I guess, speculative meta science / sociology of science question. So as you were mentioning earlier when we were replying to like Michael's question, the teams that the science, operates in like are really grown. And part of that is because you need a lot higher specialization. Like, if you look at like physics papers or biology papers, you need to be the expert on this specific theory or this specific protein or something like that. And, that seems inevitable. And also at the same side, kind of like talking to scientists, it also seems like sometimes scientists feel like there's not enough like generalist thinking. And like maybe you can benefit from that as well. Like to maybe like give a concrete example, like last year, for example, I read an interesting paper about like generalizability and like variability in its connection to learning. And basically like its conclusion was that the same sort of thing was like independently discovered and named like in computer science and like language learning and developing the psychology and so on and so on. And it seems like the fields could have benefited from, more interaction in that sort of way. So I guess the speculative question for you is, do you have any thoughts on that sort of balance? Do you think that we're valuing specialization enough, or do you think maybe we're like overvaluing it? We should have more generalists. Is it that we have like just the homeostasis is not right? Maybe we have like different sort of structures or like training. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Great question. Great question. I think this is like really core to a lot of things that are happening kind of in science and meta science right now. This is a bit of a cop-out answer. I think to actually get more generalizability, you actually need more specialization. You almost need people specialized in generalizability. So I think one big problem right now is that there are sort of just a couple of buckets that people have. They feel like they can contribute in a scientific role. And it's sort of like you can either be a tenured faculty academic, in which case then you have to not only do your scientific exercises, but oftentimes you're expected to teach. You're expected to be a sort of a mentor. If you invent something, like maybe you then have to navigate like a tech transfer office to like be able to think about commercialization, in addition to whatever like family, home life, balance you have. And so it's really hard. You're sort of asking these people to be like 6 different things at once. And no surprise, sometimes people are not actually that good at all parts of the role. In this paper on sort of mRNA vaccines I was mentioning earlier, one interesting thing that I think came out of it is highlighting that even though Caitlin Carrico and her co-author Weissman are both absolutely brilliant researchers, they were not very good at kind of either like the social diffusion of ideas, or just small talk, presenting at conferences, getting your ideas out there. If you look at the citations in the first 10 years of their paper, it was really, really kind of small, and they weren't getting invited to talk to things. And colleagues talk about them being kind of like bristly, prickly personalities that you didn't actually want to spend that lot of time around. Similarly, they got stuck in like a tech licensing fight for like 5-6 years with the University of Pennsylvania. Maybe that was the tech transfer office's fault. I'm totally open to that, but I think probably like a person more skilled in sort of the specialized skills of launching a business or commercialization probably would have done better. And so here was a case where actually society's reliance on sort of this unusual confluence of skills of being an amazing, excellent researcher, and also being a good sort of mentor and teacher, and then also being able to commercialize and diffuse your own ideas really sunk us. I think that was part of the reason for this kind of long lag time. And so having more like, you could call them like scientific operator roles, where like your job is to actually come aside, top researchers and help them think about the kind of commercialization or business side. Maybe you're sort of like, a scientific COO type. That's like a kind of more general role that could help, work across disciplines, but is actually a lack of insufficient specialization. Similarly, on kind of the trainee side, I think right now you're either a grad student or you're a postdoc. and then you try to go into the academic faculty side. But there's a lot of people who may be better in almost like staff scientist roles, where they just like they really specialize in knowing how to work a particular kind of lab instrument or a set of tests, and like that is what you do. And in a lot of commercial sectors, we would say, oh, the guy who's great at running like the semiconductor fabrication machine, like let him run that. Don't make him also do a bunch of this other stuff. But again, we don't have great ways in our current scientific ecosystem to let people specialize in a particular staff scientist role. And so I think those are kind of two very specific examples that kind of come off my head.
Thank you.
Just a very quick question. You've mentioned the mRNA paper a few times. I'm not familiar with that one. Could you
let
link
me
it
link that
or
for sure.
information? Yeah.
And this is not like comprehensive, but I think takes a look at several interesting barriers that kind of slowed the development of mRNA vaccines. Just put it in the chat.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Sam, you can go for it.
I see. Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. Just again, yes, thank you very much for your time. I have a question, maybe following up with what you were saying. Sorry. What do you think were the roles? What do you think is the role of? I don't know if you are like emergent ventures. I think is the name, grants or fast grants. These grants that appear out of like on the internet and seem to like really attract like wild ideas. Do you think? Yes. How? What could be the potential? Do they have potential? Yes, I think will be my question.
Yeah, I mean, I think demonstratively they do have potential. It's been remarkable to see kind of what Tyler has been able to fund through that kind of structure. I mean, both I think he did kind of a version of fast grants during COVID, which was really impactful and kind of funded a lot of pretty important testing or therapeutic technologies that really came developed later. But then on the personal side, yeah, he's got emergent ventures, which is sort of more for young people with sort of ambition. Again, he's almost trying to capture what sort of this culture within Silicon Valley and maybe diffuse it across a wider set of folks. But he's constantly encouraging people to think about a more ambitious version of what they want to do. And I think that's great. And so that's awesome for Tyler. I think on what can like governments or kind of the public sector learn from this? One, I think, really important lesson is just the value of speed. So both during a pandemic, obviously every single day matters. And so if you could have accelerated, some new testing or therapeutic, or obviously the vaccines by just a couple of weeks, that would have been massively important. Not to keep plugging various papers we've written, but I'm going to do another one that Maxwell Tabarrok wrote for us here, sort of looking at the NSF and the NIH and their sort of reaction during COVID and the pandemic and how quickly they were able to get grants out the door. And he showed basically NSF was able to get grants out the door about 4 months faster than the NIH, which is incredibly important during a pandemic of all times, but I think also during normal times. And one of the things he points out is that the NSF has a couple of particular programs that operate more like fast grants. And so these are called rapid and eager grants, but they, rather than relying on external peer review, just rely on internal staff scientist review. And the people working at the NSF, they're very smart. They're scientists. They're a lot of the same people that would be doing work in the field or could otherwise be peer reviewers. But by sort of like just shrinking it, on occasion to this like smaller staff scientist review, they were able to do effectively 2 to 3 week turnaround, kind of similar to fast grants. And I think this has not gotten nearly as much attention, but like it funded a lot of like pretty cool and exciting stuff. But one interesting thing is that the NIH does not have similar programs. And in fact, we're still kind of investigating the legal background here, but it seems like they may not legally be able to do this. Congress might have to give NIH explicit flexibility or authorization to use a fast grant style thing, because currently their interpretation is that we have to go through external peer review for every single grant that we want to give out, except for their like kind of small intramural grants. But that's like a really big barrier for the NIH being able to fund things quickly. So I think that's maybe the number one lesson I would learn out of kind of Tyler's experiments with fast grants, is just that speed is incredibly important, and it's not just like a nice to have. It actually enables like fundamentally like better science and more responsive science to society. And so trying to find ways to help our public institutions be able to integrate that lesson would be really valuable.
I kind of think about what you just said, and it does seem like I would assume that the NIH has a lot of these rules and restrictions for reasons. Obviously, we don't want corruption or nepotism or things like that. How much of a risk is there, do you think, of that kind of trade-off?
Yeah, so I think that's exactly right. The one lesson I'm constantly trying to encourage folks to think through is the fact that rules and regulations don't just come out of the blue for no reason. There's usually some precipitating event, and so understanding kind of why did this emerge in the first place is really important for actually making sure that you're making changes that are sort of long-term durable. And so I think, yeah, fear of corruption, fear of nepotism is a really big concern and part of why a lot of this happened. I'd say a lot of it is also fear of discretion. So if you talk to like scientific, bureaucrats, some of the folks running these agencies, like their worst nightmare is basically being called in front of Congress and sort of grilled in front of, a Senate testimony and asked, why did you fund this study where a shrimp was running on an underwater treadmill? Don't you know that this is an absolute waste of taxpayer resources? And despite the fact that, like, who knows, maybe actually it was, ex ante plausible that there was some useful thing that could come out of the study. It's very easy to make, especially basic scientific grants, sound very ridiculous, kind of in the public sector. And so I almost think peer review, especially or external peer review, emerged as like a defense mechanism actually against that kind of attack, and basically being able to say, hey, look, we didn't sort of make this decision on our own. We relied on a sort of a group of very serious external scientists, and they said that these were the best things to fund, and so don't blame us, basically. And I don't think that's the only reason, but I do think that's like part of what's happening. I think my overall message would be that these things arose for a reason, but we can try to make tests and we can sort of see how do things change when we run new experiments. And so one interesting thing, and we're still trying to gather the data on this, but was the quality of grants issued through the NSF, through this like quasi-fast grants, was that any different than the NIH in terms of the success or the hit rate, or was there higher rates of fraud or abuse? These are ultimately like empirical questions, and you can run experiments or kind of think thoughtfully about the program design to actually see kind of what happened. I think what I would suspect is that actually the internal staff review at the NSF is like also a pretty serious check. And especially if you're dealing with kind of like smaller grants, I think the risk of fraud is less concerning. And so I would guess it's like totally worth it from a risk reward perspective. But I think you're right that is sort of one reason why that emerged in the first place.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so my question is, so you mentioned Institute for Progress work in infrastructure policy, which is not necessarily a subject that young people would view as attractive. Yet subjects like infrastructure policy, agri-tech, waste management are very critical. So my question is, how can we incentivize young people to work on subjects that are critical yet overlooked or not even known?
Good question. I think there's a couple of ways. One is just highlighting what is exciting or what is important about this. I think there's a lot of people, say in Silicon Valley, that work on topics that on the surface are not like very sexy. Like, how do you make data management, database management, like 10% more effective? It's not something people are naturally inclined to work on. But once you're kind of in the field and you sort of like have caught up with like what are the things that people are discussing here, it's actually exciting to be on the frontier of a technical area and making novel contributions. Helps, of course, also when these are very highly paid positions. And so one thing you could try to do is make it higher status or higher pay, basically, to work in areas where you think are really important. But I think my number one thing is just not enough people know how important things like infrastructure are, or within the case of biosecurity, like we could do better sort of wastewater management or wastewater surveillance, basically seeing like where are novel pathogens spreading within wastewater. Again, not something that is like super sexy, but it's actually incredibly important. But just highlighting them, elevating them, raising them is, I think, the lowest hanging fruit for encouraging more people to work on them. Related to this is basically, I think there's a huge gap between what are tractable questions that people on the frontier of an area, or especially within government, are actually thinking about. What are the key questions they need to have answered before they can work on something? And what are most people, what do they think are the relevant questions? And so one thing that I think organizations like ourselves, but also lots of others can do, is try to like make that more legible, help clarify and make more externally visible kind of, here are the actual questions, here are the real bottlenecks. If solved, or if answers could be given, or if more research could be done on questions X, Y, and Z, that would really enable sort of the whole policy world to kind of move in tandem on this. And so I think that is another kind of visibility, but that's where I would start. And then you could go to things like paying people more downstream.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll end with Brian's question here.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, I was just curious if you knew or if you guys were working on, I know Congress is working on standing up ARPA-H, and I haven't really followed it, so I don't really know where they are on that. And I was just curious if you knew or were working on getting some of those new science funding mechanisms into ARPA-H, or if it's just going to be sort of like another ARPA-E, so more flexibility, but maybe not some of the specific like fast grants and stuff like that that are very interesting. And I hope that we could get a chance to see somewhere in some institution.
Yeah, for sure. So ARPA-H is still, I think, very early in its life cycle. They are, I think a couple of maybe months ago, they kind of announced like, here are our initial set of like program officers and kind of areas they're investing in, but they are trying to think through kind of, there's always this little bit risk reward within a new federal agency of how do you set yourself up for success in the long term and actually making durable progress on the issues that matter, while also having what are sometimes called quick iconic wins, basically things that give you the political support to be able to continue in the short term. Because that's always the risk with sort of some of these science funding things is you can make investments that don't pay off for 15, 20 years, but if your funding gets cut after year 3, a lot of good you can do. And so there's, I think, some balancing right now that's trying to happen on that. I think they are primarily focused on sort of this ARPA model. So for folks who don't know, the DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, is a very sort of famous R&D funder. But the main thing that they've pioneered is this model of highly empowered program managers who kind of have deep technical expertise in an area and really have tons of flexibility to be able to make grants or investments in a wide range of either academic or kind of industry actors and kind of actually encourage them to work together in ways that might not be natural. And so, this was really useful for, the ARPANET kind of was the early internet. They helped pioneer like GPS satellites. They were actually pretty pivotal in early mRNA vaccines. They got some funding, I think, around like 2005. And so this model has been useful in sort of the defense world. It's been tried to be copied and pasted in other places like ARPA-E, where I think it's been useful, but less obviously like a massive success. And so there's a lot of analysis right now on like what actually makes an ARPA model successful. Was this something that only worked kind of within the defense context where you have sort of really close integration between the research producers and the ultimate buyer, the military, where that's like less true in energy or healthcare? Or is there something else about the ARPA model that seems to really work well? I think this is actually a big open question, is kind of what makes the ARPA model tick? What parts or attributes of it seem to really be important across different sectors? If while I'm plugging things, we had a really nice kind of reading list if anyone wants to dive in deeper into the ARPA model. And so this is sort of a collection of resources some of our scholars put together across both DARPA, ARPA-H, and a wide number of the other ARPAs, sort of both in the US and actually ones that have been tried kind of overseas. But I don't know that we have a clear answer of kind of like what makes the ARPA successful. I too hope that they will also use things like innovation prizes or advanced mark commitments or other things. And they do have flexibility to do that. So they have other transactions agreement, what I was referring to earlier. And if you're willing to be creative about how you structure those, you should be able to do a lot of different things through that.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Thank you very much, Caleb, for speaking with us today. Yeah, it was a pleasure having you here, and it was very interesting. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. Happy to have joined. And if any of you have additional questions, both my co-founder and I, Alec, are on Twitter. It's easy to chat with us there, or my email is just caleb@ifp.org if you have additional stuff. So, but great to talk with all of you.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.